Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, experts, partners. A year ago, in full audience here, we discussed the topic of trust here at the Gaidar Forum, and I believe that nobody expected that such dramatic events may take place within 12 months with this topic and the whole world. And so it seems to me that the starting point in our today's conversation is where we should look at what has happened. Because, look, the Gaidar Forum is an international forum. Here we've always been talking not only about Russia, although we're going to talk about Russia in a very focused and specific way, but we are talking about what is happening in the world and what will continue happening there. 3 days ago, a Deutsche Bank report came out about the future of the global development, which stated that the era of globalization has come to an end, the era which since 1970s continued until the 2020th, has been changed by a different one, the period of global disorder. Indeed, the links are being severed between the countries, the trade communications, barriers are emerging, the trade wars are being waged. So, to begin with, let's try to understand the basic global movement. What does it do to trust? Because the feeling is that during the past 12 months, the glass walls of mistrust have grown, and we're afraid of embracing our friends and being close to our enemies because we're afraid that our next of kin can be infectious. But the whole system of international relations have been turned upside down, completely cut away from each other, and there are cargo planes flying, all the way without any understanding of the final destinations. Is this a trend? Let's have a discussion about this lack of trust. Definitely something that has appeared in the world. Is it something temporary, or should we expect it to stay? And I suggest that Alexey Kudrin should begin talking, not because Alexey Leonidovich this year is the head of the International Association of the Public Audit Agencies, but because Alexey Kudrin, as the economist, as the thinker, as a public figure, have thought about these topics a lot and spoken about, and he understands what happens in the world, and I believe much better than many of us. So what is the forecast, Alexey? Is globalization over? Thank you, Alexander. This is indeed a very good thing that you started this conversation from globalization rather than the pandemic, because the pandemic adds on additional trends into the overall landscape. But of course, in the core of it, generally speaking, is the order of international relations and the international trade. And currently we are living through the period when, in the international arena, the leader is going to be changed. The economy, which in the subsequent years is going to be leading the world and to a great extent expanding its effect upon all of the global processes. I mean, China is coming to the forefront. There was a period when we witnessed that the United States was promoting the liberalization of the capital expansion and trading prevailing in the WTO in order for all of the borders to be brought down for the American, very competitive kind of goods, and from that the United States derived its income. And currently we see that the picture is changing. It is China that is currently becoming the leader of such a liberalization. I suppose that China is not yet strong enough, is not reputationally strong in terms of the international platforms. I was able to see it myself through the examples of dealing through WTO and IMF and others, but nevertheless these decisions by President Trump, which I would say have been a little bit ahead of our times. I mean, suspending 2 major regional treaties that haven't come into force, generally speaking, introducing the tariff barriers, which effectively very strongly devalued the effect from such an international important institution as WTO, demonstrates that, yes, generally speaking, the institutions which provided for that that stability are losing the form of significance. I'm sorry to interrupt. Do I understand correctly that your understanding of the process comes from the notion that since the lead in the global economy is changing, quite clearly there is a certain contention growing which grows barriers, but then the new leader starts to push these barriers away, like China, who created this Asia-Pacific free trade zone, and through that this new project of globalization that is coming to the surface. I mean, globalization is coming back with the new drivers. Yes, indeed, but this is going to be a long-term process. It will take a lot of time, at least 30 years, and there is a set of circumstances now that we are at it. The American currency, as the international reserve currency, will continue prevailing for a long period of time, at least for the next 30, 40, 50 years maybe. The Chinese currency is not going to become yet the global reserve currency because China is not yet making enough of the free capital movement into its economy in terms of the definition of the value of assets. The statistics is not very credulous. I mean, the Chinese economy, in a bit unknown entity, a little bit of a black box, despite the leading world companies who are listed at the international stock exchanges. In this sense, as long as China is not enough open and more transparent for the rest of the world, only after that happens we'll be able to forecast the China's effect upon the global economy, and I believe that China was past that journey within 30 years. 10 years ago I said if China wanted to make RMB international currency, it would take it 10 years. It would be enough. But as it turned out, the Chinese leadership is taking a more cautious look at the need to get involved so quickly. Yes, they're taking their time, indeed. And so 30 years is going to be enough. Right now, in terms of the purchasing power parity, they are the biggest economy. I mean, converting it into different language, it means that in the physical volume, all of the goods in the world, they are producing more than the U.S. and quite competitive goods with that, and that turned them into a serious leading competitor in all of the global centers in the US and Europe as well. Yes, I understand, but we are not rather talking about the global trade, but about the trends of trust in the world. Do I understand correctly that this new driver, this new leader of the global growth is something that doesn't generate too much of a trust impulse, because amongst us, we should say that this is a digital totalitarian regime. It's a closed system. In the meantime, it is. And so what will happen to the trust in the world, because China and America are important, but in the end of the day, we live and work here in Russia, and we intend to remain here. But what with the trust trend, well, my next talking point is, or my forecast, that regrettably, the role of some of the institutions is going to continue to be diluted. I mean, the ones which brought about traditional rules of the games and relationships, in a certain way, they're going to be revised, and it would be really great to have them revised in a planned way. And in this sense, I would say that President-elect Biden is going to be conducive to a more staged achievement of a certain consensus. I do recall simply the 2,000 years I spent in continuous negotiations about these key institutions in the world and the capital flow and the results of the 2008 crisis, when we were looking at the way the global financial markets, what should be the way that they should be regulated in order to avoid these disbalances which would turn themselves into crisis. So these institutions were being developed in that way, and I hope that that process will continue, and possibly this period of the new order taking place will take some time, maybe 10 to 20 years, in some instances 10, in some things 20 years, but new alliances are going to be emerging, which will be defined by the new set of orders, and in that sense we'll pass through a certain 30, 20-year-long journey of uncertainties and new order taking place, which eventually is not going to be like it used to be with the United States being a single polar system where a single center would be most influential. It would be more pluralistic, it would be more versatile and flexible, and I do believe that the world will take us there, including new technologies, promoting new products into the market, and innovations which, in the similar token, are going to be actively developed, like in India, in China, like in Russia, and in Europe. And my last statement, if I still have some time left, of course, the pandemic, it is seriously pushing us forward, like the destruction of some of the institutions, as well as the need to have new institutions being created. And the barriers that I currently see, I do not attribute them to the element of mistrust, because this same thing, I mean, the barriers as well as various restrictions for mobility of people and goods, these are more of a protective kind of measures, like in any quarantine, like any lockdown that ever took place in some of the world region, which would eventually disappear. So I would say that this is not just the core thing in this mistrust. It's a necessary objective measure, but this is exactly what produces this new list of mistrust factors when we do not trust information about the pandemic, when we do not trust the vaccines, when we do not trust the measures that the public governance is offering because we believe that they are either excessive or not enough. Some of the people don't take them, and so COVID distance is this new movement that we see, and that is being juxtaposed upon many other things, like the Eurosceptics, who in their turn are trying to torpedo, attack some other institutions. Well, this is the destiny of trust, and this is the destiny of institutions. If these institutions are to gradually transform themselves, then the trust is going to be recovered. If they're going down, then this trust is going to be very flimsy. Well, my main argument in that mistrust is a much more expensive kind of a luxury or a phenomenon than the kind of trust that is being created through the institutions. And these institutions, I mean, best to have the institutions as they are rather than that is going to be an inevitable objective process, and we're going to follow it. We're going again to try and revive the security relationships, including the cyber security. We're going to have new trading treaties, national, international, the global one. We'll have new financial institutions, which, in terms of these very complex transactions which pass through the digital institutions, the world is going to inevitably follow that path. It won't close in on itself, because that will be wrought with stepping back or lagging behind the progress, so one must fully be able to fit into this trend. Svetlana, could you please tell us, from the point of view of the Russian business and those who are looking for ways to develop, how these entities and people see this global situation? Because the way you can think is that there is an erosion of international trust. However, there are regional alliances that are shaping up, import substitutions, trust to domestic entities is growing. You know, trust is such a slight thing because there is a closed social capital, open social capital, and in Russia, at the same time, there are stronger links now between the domestic entities and players in terms of import substitution. So in your mind, this global process, how has it affected the response on the part of the Russian business? It's thinking about the future in terms of this mutual trust growing. Well, of course, last year, the business, having lost some of the external and domestic markets, was looking for new opportunities in the global markets as well. And I would like to say that if we are to consider the expertise of the Agency for Strategic Initiatives and our projects, during this very difficult years, we were able to take 40 projects on the national technological initiatives to the global level. Seemingly, everyone was locked down, and import substitution was something that many focused upon to support our local businesses. But many of our projects have been commissioned to further be developed by the US customers and the BRICS countries and really continue to fare well. And what's the explanation? Is it because of the new niches emerging in the markets? Let's say the healthcare technologies really took off, or the PPE technology took off. Is it a result of some revolutionary processes in the market, or the result of a long-term trend in the Russian market? Yes, this is the result of a long-term effort, because despite the situation, the Russian development institutions, which operate in the international markets, never stopped. And so as part of our initiative, which was titled Go Global, we have united all of the resources: Minister of International Relations, Minister of Economic Development, Russian International Cooperation Agency, Roscongress Agency, and so the format of a remote dialogue, including with our international partners, helped us to, in certain cases, run down our costs in order to get these new contracts. Now, speaking about certain global international trends, something, yes, I can really confirm what you've just said, that the online format helped us to enjoy a much greater ease with which the top international expert enter conversations, or the foreigners, as they apply to get enrolled into the Moscow State University, because simultaneously certain relationships, they expand, and this compressed trust really helped us. Sorry to interrupt you. Yes, on top of it, last year, as part of our Russian initiatives, we launched a gathering of the best regional practices, municipal ones as well, related to running down the costs in the self-isolation regime against COVID. And we were able to then transfer that practices and expertise into the relationship with the World Bank, UN, the BRICS countries. And we, as a feedback, we enjoyed a very open and transparent dialogue, because all of our counterparts were so keen to have it with us. Last year, India and China presented their ways of dealing with the pandemic and the way they supported their businesses, which points to the trust. So the trust, this is a very individual attitude, either towards your partner, towards your counterpart in a dialogue or a business, be it a country or a human being. And so I would say that the interregional links, on the contrary, were getting stronger. Alexey already mentioned it, that politics, if we look at it, the destruction of trust, it began before the pandemic. Speaking about the US, this gap in the relationships with China, with the other national partners, mistrust, open mistrust, expressed mistrust to the institutions. This is not the end of globalization. Yes, indeed, there will be a bit of a leeway. There will be a period of individualism, so to say. Economic selfishness, rather. Yes, but this is the time now for the parties to take seats at the negotiating table and somewhere alter the rules of the game, somewhere change their agreements. And so I would say that very shortly we'll be witnessing the emergence of new institutions which would face new tasks, new objectives, where we would be able to go back to the kind of trust we had and maybe even multiply it. Oh, thank you. But if I may say also a couple of words on the topic, I do agree with you two, more than with Deutsche Bank, because I don't think that the globalization is over, because, you know, one generalizing it this way should look not at 30 years ahead, but 200 years ahead. Because if we take a look at what has been going on since the middle of the 19th century, why the middle of the 19th century? You know, 1857 is the first global crisis. So, looking at the globalization indicators related to the overflow of people and capital and services, this is very much a fluctuating process. Globalization very often went up and down. There is no straightforward curve, but this fluctuating nature is quite obvious, because we understand that one force is the gravitational one related to the economy, which reduces the cost and opens up the benefit of the distribution of labor, while the other force of it is related with the culture cultural distance, because it's very difficult to manage the whole process when there are different, diverse cultural expectations requiring very concentrated coordination. So it moves in different ways simultaneously, sort of breathes in and out. And so I do agree with my colleagues who were saying that we have rather passed through the low point, and the recovery process that is going to take place now is not going to be straightforward, and the shape of trust in many ways will depend upon what will happen to the international institutions, the extent to which they will be revived, updated, and whether this is going to be an abrupt process or would take a staged form. If I may correct you a little bit, because these are the kind of conclusions that I do agree with, most of them, but I would say that we haven't yet passed through the low point yet, because a revision of the institutions, I mean, the Trumpian period, who really have shaken up the international relations and in many ways severed them. This is just the beginning. So we are just about to come to our own awareness in the world. And I would say that, for example, we will have to wait for a long time until the real alternative appears to the dollar. Euro, 20 years now around, hasn't been able to really stand up to the dollar. Not because the European economy is not so fast and competitive like other national economies. No, I mean to say that this is the kind of process which has just about started in terms of certain cataclysms. We will still feel them in certain international aspects. Now, cybersecurity right now is the priority topic where all of us together will have to agree. How much time will it take? 5, 10 years? And what will happen during that time? What kind of institutions, financial ones or personal data institutions are going to be subjected to attacks and destruction? So we will still feel very unpleasant symptoms of these things while we're not yet reaching full agreement. Well, I mean that we see eye to eye in terms of the long-term forecast, in terms of the revival, but whether we have passed through the low point or not, as is usually the case, we are pessimists and optimists. No, I would say that we're all optimistic here. Yes, we're quite optimistic, I agree. Yes, and that is why I believe that it's about time for us to talk about the situation in Russia with the trust and with the future. So with your permission, I would set it rolling by saying a couple of words in order to go over to a more operational kind of a format and discourse, because the establishment of the international cybersecurity institutions is not so much dependent upon us compared to what's going on in our own home yard. And whatever we can do here with trust is not only the topic to discuss, but this is, in a bit of a way, the accountability of those who are present here, those who are listening to us, those who agree with us, or those who criticize us. So just a couple of words to set the matter straight. So let's remember what we were saying about the economy, and in this sense, the problem, of course, and here I do agree how Alexey very nicely put it, investing into the institutions is much cheaper than, generating loss from the mistrust, because it's an institutional trap, like corruption, like the economic losses from economic barriers, low competition. In all such cases, it's a bit of an economic tax which reduces economic efficiency, which deters us to achieve opportunities to jump on the spiraling curve of economic opportunities. In terms of the scale, losses from mistrust have been evaluated, and thank God that was done by independent experts, not us. I mean, the well-known French economists Jean Auzan and Pierre Caillou, who came up with a comparative international survey of the so-called using environmental impact method, identifying the net gross domestic product, showing that Russia could have had by 69% more, almost 40, almost even more than 40% of the GDP per capita is what we're losing because of this mistrust tax. so to say. And I believe that the losses because of the corruption, administrative barriers, low competition, and monopolies, and because this is not about the monopoly rent, but also they are comparable to this, but I believe that these are the biggest losses that we are suffering from. So this is my first statement. So generally speaking, what we are trying to deal with is the very big economic scale task. Now, the second point is whether we can find a solution, because the loss from mistrust is losing a dead cargo, as opposed from the corruption where there is always a very specific recipient. Yes, in the area of mistrust there are vested interests which serve various arrangements, issue warranties and guarantees and so on and so forth, but this is not really the case of a corruption or the monopoly rent. At the same time, I believe a very important circumstance is that in this area, the technology breakthrough that Maria and Alexey referred to previously produced new impulse, the fair wind, because what has been, of course, before the pandemic, but dramatically was promoted over the crisis of 2020, digital ecosystems, the so-called distributed trust, which you find a very high level of trust toward digital platform, because these are very well working institutions produced by aggregators based upon the AI technology, which cut off the non-compliance, and so this trust started expanding upon these technology platforms, and consequently there is a challenge to the previous institutions. The Moscow State Economic Department in spring, we did the estimate that based on the European data and in the autumn in terms of what is going on in Russia, there is a substitution effect taking place. These new institutions of trust, they are growing, and they are displacing the traditional government institutions as service providers in the EU. And won't imagine where the government starts to lose. The policing and judicial functions effectively are being done by these platforms. The most ineffective public institutions, they are the first ones to diminish, and the government will have to do something about it, because as it turns out, the fair wind blowing in our sails, and the trust continues to go because of the reasons that new institutions, new technologies appear, and such an institutional provocation comes to the forefront, that something has to be done to the national system. The public servants will have to really do something about it, because based upon our surveys, the level of trust to the Russian government, 49%, to the private digital services, 59%. So institutional competition, that's what we're dealing with now. But these are the questions not only to the government and to the changing institutions. This is also about the culture, because the trust is related to the corporate governance, to what is being taught at school, the way it is being taught at school and in the high schools, whether anything is being pronounced from the high place that, only one voice is right and the rest should follow. Oh, this is a project-based activity and networking activity. So, going over to the discussion of this particular topic taking place in Russia, I would ask Svetlana to begin by answering the next question. What is it that the business organized in such networks, by the networks on the networks, like the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, what business can realistically do, and whether it wants to do this in order for this high economic tax of mistrust to bring it down and, I suppose, to get some benefit, not only for the country but for themselves. Otherwise, what kind of business is this? Well, effectively, I was also very impressed, Alexander, by the figures that you quoted, that we are losing because of this mistrust. Colossal percentages in our gross domestic product. I mean, the economy is losing. We've also taken a look at the recent data covering 100 countries of the sociological polls about the trust to the government, mutual trust, and the economic growth and the GDP absolutely being confirmed by the figures presented by the French economists. So what you can do about it, Alexander, and again from the point of view of businesses, I believe that trust as such can be raised higher, more trust to the institutions inside the business environment, trust on a mutual basis, the public kind of a trust. We may not be the trailblazers here, not at all, because there are such countries as Australia and Estonia who within the 10-year period by 20-30%, almost twice. I mean, the very small neighboring country of Estonia almost raised the generalized trust level twofold. I mean, among the majority of people, Estonia, amongst other things, by launching the electronic government platform, which very seriously, like you've mentioned, strengthened the level of trust towards the electronic platforms and digital services much higher than the analog kind of formats of the interaction between the government and the population. Australia also raised the level of trust through working on the strategy aimed at strengthening the family and the community. It's not on the side of the economy and the businesses, you see, more of a public kind of a realm where it did the right thing. So when we talk about trust, this is not only running down transactional costs, but also raising the level of activity, the level of business activity, again, the level of communal activity. And we've taken a look at another sociological polling when in the 90s, Russia and the citizens were used to more of a collective kind of a communal existence, and just 10 years down the road we became very individual. Yes, trust is very good, because international surveys do show that the individuals are building the bridging social capital. I mean, the trust to alien groups, strange groups, other groups. Yes, that's very right. There was a bit of a recoil even because we were growing tired from the kind of communal notions that were forced upon us. And so currently, working with different regions, working with different communities and leaders, we do feel that there is a very strong need for it right now. And so people are ready to cooperate around certain targets and objectives and interesting tasks, around important initiatives that they see for themselves. So what are we doing right now? What do we plan to do in terms of strengthening this trust? First of all, you already mentioned the control over the supervisory activity, because the factor of the judiciary system in terms of the control and supervision makes a very important contribution if we talk about the economy of trust, whatever applies to the relationship between businesses and the law enforcement agencies. Today we support the practice of verified businesses. We launched together with the law enforcement the platform for business, which has been around for 2 years, which has in it totally different principles upon which the law enforcement collaborates with the businessmen, where businesses have the possibility of an independent audit in various central departments of these agencies, when whatever the territorial divisions do in terms of the well-substantiated or not-substantiated audits and opening criminal cases. So the central office, yeah, you should agree, this is the topic that we were talking about 10 and 20 years ago when Herman Gref was putting together this program. Alexey, I'm sure, remembers it quite well. But what I mean to say is that we should first answer the question, as was known from one of the famous movies, from the quote of Saba, what do you need it for? Why does the business need it? Not in terms of, having just a passing conversation over a cup of tea. So I do remember that there used to be a good case that you presented some time ago at one of the conferences of a company which is called Vkusvil. Why? I mean, this company put together a totally different mechanism that it follows. Well, because the businesses, first of all, act on the consideration of generating income. And so the business learned to estimate the losses from the slow trust. And so this Vkusvil company is able to demonstrate digitally how, thanks to being able to raise the trust within the company itself, makes it possible to save 60 million rubles monthly through introducing digital services, where the company employees have the right to make a mistake. And this is not punishable, but this is considered as the reason to learn something new. And these kind of practices can be introduced in any organization in this country, which would very seriously strengthen the trust towards them amongst their customers. So you mean to say that the business has become aware that there are certain easily reduced transactional costs which are related to high level of trust, and these are reduced in a much easier way than the corruption costs or the low market competition. And so they went into that as the way to achieve their economic outcomes. Exactly. And now the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, like this super system whereby the businesses and various communities are moving forward. So apart from what you just described, that apparently we need new approaches in dealing with the law enforcement, the control and supervision, I absolutely agree with that. Because I do say that this is the biggest obstacles on the way to really tap into the entrepreneurial potential in this country. The system of, rather the lack of it, I mean, the lack of a collective political control. If it is possible to achieve it, then the economic results are going to be totally better. And in this sense, what else your agency believes to be important and intends to do? Well, for example, this year, we're also going to present the results of the quality of life in the regions as a ranking, and there is a very interesting indicator, the loyalty index, in terms of how well are you satisfied living in that location, living in that region, how much of your future you connect to yourself, to that region, and we see that it directly correlates to trust, where the trust to the government authorities, where the level of trust to, let me say, to the municipality is higher, then the loyalty index is much stronger, and that means that an individual is not going to leave that place, he's going to stay there. It means that, on the contrary, these regions do enjoy a positive surplus in terms of the mobility inflow, better birth rate. Yes, dear governors, there are instruments available which are related to a level of trust to you as an individual, but which can be converted very easily into economic benefit. Yes, we do see this as a toolkit for the governors, for the public figures, to improve the level of trust regionally, and how that can be later converted into an economic benefit to the region. Well, I must admit that we discussed this particular issue at the expert council under the Speaker of the upper house of the Russian Parliament, Svetlana, and I. We had a conversation with the head of the Federal Tax Service, and there were some good ideas coming from the governors who suggested what should be done in order to, because there is a growing awareness of the fact that these instruments really can produce results. And the head of the Kamchatka region and the head of the Archangel region were mentioning such instruments as standards and KPIs related to elected officials acting on their pre-election promises. Yes, indeed. Participatory budgeting, selective taxation. But let's move over to what the government could have done. Well, Alexey, I would like to emphasize once again, this is the question not to you in your capacity as the head of the Federal Audit Chamber, but rather to an individual who has a wealth of experience of working in international, in Russian institutions, in creating strategic documents, what one should do in order for us to turn this situation with the trust towards the institutional structures in Russia. Because I shall remind you, like in the first part of our conversation, we mentioned that situation with international trust depends upon what happens to the international institutions. But in Russia, it very much depends upon what happens to the Russian institutions, because those who grew off the digital platforms, I can't say that everything is so perfect there. There are problems of user agreements that you cannot fiddle into. There is a threat of monopolism. We see that this platform can decide at their own discretion to really simply, exclude somebody, and we ask why, because that is our corporate policy. But with the public institutions, we also have quite a few problems which, if being solved, could create different impetus for the development of trust. Could we hypothesize about a little bit? Well, first of all, I would like to support this topic, which we convert from the conversation about trust, because it's a standing topic, as long as there is a public governance, this topic is important, but nevertheless we convert it into the area of instrumental notions, where we're saying that we want to plan these kinds of steps which would strengthen trust. So the whole question is what for, amongst other questions. Seemingly, it's always clear that the government or the public agency that is being trusted is able to institute reforms which, in the end of the day, are aimed at making the life of the people better. And so you have to get this mandate. All have to understand it in terms of the honesty of election and the straightforwardness of the political system. You very seriously underscore that despite the fact that we are talking about the role of the law enforcement agencies, maybe in being such that slows down the business activity. Unfortunately, this whole topic has become ever more acute, and Alexander very correctly stated it, that the public, collective political control is important to be able to regulate this area. So, generally speaking, political institutions and the public institutions which are being built as transparent, which have various checks and balances and various control elements, represent the most important thing. So when we now start talking about what needs to be done, we need to very scrupulously establish these models which would enable, in terms of the work of the law enforcement agencies, the kind of objectives that they have to pursue and fight crime, not to deter, not to slow down, but to facilitate justice and arbitration in the areas where invariably there will be disputes, like in business and human society. And so the system requires from us to spend more time. I would similarly say, I will simply just quote another point. I made it already in the past. During the past 10 years, we've been growing at a 1% pace, and if we to decompose it and to try and figure out why, one of the points here will be low investments in terms of real investments. In 2020, we will be at the level of 2011. Generally speaking, since 2011, investments haven't been growing in real terms. Why all of a sudden? We have people, and the productivity of labor in Russia is twice below the European one. So, roughly speaking, this is an enormous resource. Just use various practices, build factories, reduce costs in any product category. You just do the economy of scale. But somehow, this turbulent kind of activity doesn't produce the effect of a driver. Why? Because the kind of institutions which may produce the guarantees to these institutions are not strong enough. I mean, the predictability from different viewpoints. Taxes are being changed. The rules of the game in terms of the rules of the business are getting altered. But there are certain positive things here as well. Because right now, what I would mention, about 3 to 4 years ago, I said that the scale of regulation and the supervisory activity is what we should, raise up twofold, and that would conform to the European level somewhere, which is more flexible, less burdensome, because, like in our case, control, permission, without any nuances. So this year, in 2020, now taking into account the decision made to restrict the controlling activity, yes, I mean, quite clearly, this is a crisis year, so it would be difficult to expect the investment to grow in fits and starts only, maybe. But again, I heard the report made by Grigorenko, who is the vice premier, about the administrative guillotine, regulatory guillotine. These are correct steps. leading towards that outcome, and they have been well thought out, and everybody agrees that the breakthrough is necessary here. But, you know, the trust between those who represent the government and the public and the citizens, because regulatory guillotine, what does it mean? It means that we trust more, and so we take down some of the barriers, and here in these paths, in these areas, we will re-agree on new terms. Well, generally speaking, to a certain extent, not in full, like many believe, the technologies and all kinds of digital platforms may raise this level of trust because they substantially eliminate this bureaucratic red tape in getting the necessary services, and there are new initiatives by the government so that the issuing various security, social security subsistence to various individual categories, mothers and disabled people, could happen without people submitting paper documents. So that, well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I very much believe that that will turn out to be a success in the area which primarily, like in the local, public documentation office, because we have witnesses like there's a great success in public administration of this particular communal services, and I'm sure that the Prime Minister, this kind of success will be able to roll out to the neighboring areas and regions. But this is not the kind of the regional aspect that Svetlana referred to. But, you know, nevertheless, this kind of area that we're talking about, this red tape and the so-called, having people, move around all kind of government offices, submitting various documents, only hearing back that I'm not entitled to this or that. Nevertheless, that has always been a very serious burden to overcome for all generations. And even now, if historically we will pass through the part of our journey where staying at home without having to go to the public office, you'll be able to get an answer you need within minutes using artificial intellect, because you are in the database, all the information about your family is there, and you get what you are entitled to. All of the permits, all of the government certificates. This is a little revolution in itself. No, this is a big revolution, I should say, because whatever occurred over the past decade, I mean, the evolving interface between a citizen and the government in various household issues that surround us is exactly what enables the level of institutional trust in Russia to remain at a very decent level. Higher only in China, for example, but in the European institutional trust is somewhere at about our level. It even went down a little bit, but I must wrap up our discussion. I would like to say, yes, go ahead, Alexey, say something. I understand that our time is running up. So I would simply like to, do the bullet points in terms of what I see a priority. First of all, I do agree that the level of institutional trust, which in Russia is quite low, based upon the Edelman's survey, we've got about 26%, while in China it's 70%, and this is indeed such an enormous gap, and that considerably affects our GDP growth because that is the economic taxation. But where I would see these initial steps that we should pursue transparency of all of the budgetary system, because there is nothing more important that we are paying taxes, and who want to know whether these taxes are being spent upon our health care. This is a taxpayer culture kind of thing. Next, let me see. Yes. The transparency and openness of the government agencies. We did the survey, we came up with a ranking. 1/3 of the ministries, by law, is not responding to the requests received from the household. 2/3 do not respond to the media requests, although the law demands it. After our ranking, situations started changing a little bit for the positive thing, but the public institutions must do that. I would also mention the public councils, including in the law enforcement, because the assessment of the work done by the law enforcement should also be done using the social polling, which is not being done, although under the law it should be done. I would also mention the fact that the culture of criticism in this country has been played down in terms of criticizing any sort of a measure or a discussion of a public nature. Here I would say we're currently in a situation where the information space is more controllable, and the critics have become more sensitive, because the fact that a lot of media outlets have been closed. At that very critical point, I must interrupt Alexey. Svetlana, would you like to say a closing word? Well, I believe that, in as far as the business is concerned, in order to strengthen the trust, there is a possibility of open platforms that we can resort to, and there are established practices in different projects related to technology development where businesses cooperate and create and produce very important products. Dear colleagues, I do feel that this is not enough. I mean, this time that we had to talk about, and we shall definitely continue. But the most important thing that we wanted to share with you, friends, and this is our common position, this is a very grand, very big topic. This is a grand agenda, and Svetlana and I do believe that this is one of the most important issues for Russia in the 2020th. Trust. And the second thing that we all agree upon, and something that Alexey mentioned, this is an operational thing. There are solutions which would allow us to do away with some of the transactional costs, change the structure of others, and achieve the economic benefit and a lot of good for the country's economy. And, of course, the cultural topic. Because in Russia, the most important question of an open and frank conversation: do you respect me? This is it. But you should raise a different one. Do you trust me? Thank you. Our conversation is over.
Изменились ли мы? Стали другими или остались собой? Принимая время, место, обстоятельства. Главное — не остановиться сегодня, чтобы стать сильнее завтра. И знать, мы вместе. И это все меняет. Ваш «Газпромбанк».
в звуке или в тексте, ушами или